In the 1840s, the first white settlers came to the area of modern Villisca. Rich farmland as far as the eye could see. Originally, the town was called the Forks. A plat was laid out in 1858 by D.N. Smith of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The town would then become Villisca, Iowa. It eventually would be a railroad town. The first sawmill reached Villisca in 1861. Local lumber would be cut to build the town. Villisca got its first schoolhouse in 1867, its first bank in 1871, and its first fire department in 1876. Villisca would grow quickly. By 1880, the population was 1,300. It had more than doubled in the past 10 years. In 1892, the town had a population of 2,000. Villisca was used to support the farms in the surrounding area. Farmers could get coal, seeds, animals, machinery, and supplies. There were many churches in the town of all different denominations. Multiple doctors were also located in town. The railroad in town was the main source of transportation of goods. This helped the town flourish for many, many years. Josiah Moore lived in the town with his family. He was a businessman who owned a farming and hardware store that would sell farming implements to local farmers, as well as items from the hardware store. Josiah Moore was 43 years old in 1912. He owned a modest, beautiful wood-framed home currently at East 2nd Street, with his wife, Sarah Moore, 39. They had 4 children. Herman Montgomery Moore was 11. Mary Catherine Moore was 10. Arthur Boyd Moore was 7, and Paul Vernon Moore was 5. By 1912, Villisca had a stable population at a little over 2,000 people. The Moore family, just like most families in the early 1900s, were very involved with their church. On the afternoon of June 9, 1912, the Moore family went to their Presbyterian church where there was a children event being held. Sarah helped coordinate the event. The kids played together, they had Bible studies and prayer groups, and the kids participated in plays. The Stallinger family was a farming family who lived just a few miles from town. Their 2 daughters, Lena Stallinger, 12, and Ina Stallinger, 8, were in town for the church event. The 2 girls were close friends with Mary Catherine Moore. They called home to ask if it would be okay if they stayed with the Moores for a sleepover. Their family agreed, so Josiah, Sarah, and the 6 children all left together to head for the Moore family home. The event ended at about 9:30 that night. It is believed that they all arrived back home sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The 2 Stallinger sisters were put to bed in the parlor room on the first floor. This was used as a guest bedroom. Josiah and Sarah slept in the master bedroom at the top of the stairs, and the Moore children slept in their bedroom adjacent to their parents' room on the 2nd floor. The attic was also on the 2nd floor on the opposite wall of the master bedroom and the children's bedroom. It was Sunday night, June 9th, 1912. It had been a normal day in Villisca, Iowa, but that would all change by morning. Mary Peckman was the Moores' next-door neighbor. She was in her 60s, and just like everyone in those days, she had to get up early and do chores, feed the animals, and get ready for the day. She started work at 4 a.m. After a few hours of work, she realized how quiet the Moore house was, which was odd since they had 4 children, and children make noise. She noticed that no one had started their chores or had even gone to the outhouse the whole time she had been outside. The Moores did not have indoor plumbing, so they had to do their business in the privy. She got curious and headed over. She knocked on their door, and when that failed, she tried to open the door, but it was locked. She tried to peek in through the windows, but all of the windows were covered, so she could not see in the Moore home. She walked over and let their chickens out, and then headed to her house and decided to call Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. She explained the situation to Ross. He had a spare key and found it odd that no one was awake in the house, so he headed over. He arrived and knocked on the front door, but no one answered. He tried shouting for his brother and sister-in-law. He eventually used the spare key to unlock the door and then walked inside while Miss Peckman waited on the front porch. He looked around the house, and it was much darker than normal. Every window was covered. He then opened the door to the parlor room where the Stollinger sisters were sleeping the night before. His heart sank with the image in front of him. The two girls lay dead on the bed. He quickly left and then told Miss Peckman to call the town marshal, Mr. Henry Horton. He was a small town marshal. Murder was very rare. He occasionally had to deal with drunks or hobos passing through from the railroad. But his little town was about to be turned upside down. Mass murder had come to Villisca. When Marshal Horton arrived, Ross Moore handed him the key and then he went inside. He saw the grisly scene in the downstairs parlor. The two Stollinger sisters had been bludgeoned while they slept. Their faces were covered. And Ina lay untouched, but Lena had been posed and her nightgown had been pulled up after her death by whatever sick individual had committed the murders. The murder weapon was an axe, and it was still in the parlor room. The mirror had been covered along with all the windows. There was a 4-pound slab of bacon on the floor in the parlor room. Marshal Horton made his way upstairs, not knowing what to expect next. The stairs led straight into the master bedroom. There was no hallway. He found Josiah and Sarah in the bed. Josiah had been severely deformed, and Sarah was not much better. Their faces were also covered. There were axe marks above their heads in the wall. It was a sloped wall, due to the shape of the roof. He then moved to the children's room. Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul had all been killed. The children's faces had also been covered after their death. The marshal headed downstairs to Ross Moore on the porch, and he said, "My God, Ross, there is someone murdered in every bed." He locked the house and then he went to fetch the doctor and call for help from other agencies. The coroner eventually took control of the scene. The doctors believed that the murders happened sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. Word spread fast about the multiple murders. Sightseers started to trickle in, but people all over town closed up their shops and headed over to the Moore residence. The Stollinger family was expecting their two young daughters home. They found out about the death of their daughters in the worst way. They tried to place a phone call over to the Moore house, and the switchboard operator must have been getting a ton of calls about the murders. When the Stollingers asked the operator to be transferred, the operator replied, "Everyone in that house is dead." That is how they found out about the murders. That afternoon, hundreds of people surrounded the Moore house. When Dr. Cooper left, some of the men from the town wanted to take a look inside. That night, a flood of people entered the crime scene. Things were moved, some things were even taken. It is unknown how many people trampled through the crime scene, but some believe it was well over 100 people. Altering the evidence, moving objects, looking at the bodies, and possibly moving the victims. The bodies of the dead were not removed until midnight. A local druggist, or what we call today a pharmacist, brought a camera into the home and he tried to take photos of the scene, but he was thrown out. A local pool hall owner grabbed a piece of Josiah Moore's loose skull to keep it as a souvenir. He then put it in his pool hall. A police officer from another town arrived that night and restored order. He kicked all the sightseers out of the house and he secured the crime scene. But it was too late. Bloodhounds and their trainers arrived from Nebraska by train that night. They were given a scent off of the axe and then set off to try and track the murderer. A large group followed the bloodhounds, a mixture of police and locals. The bloodhounds paused in front of Frank Jones's home for a short time. He was a prominent man in Villisca, Word spread that the bloodhound stopped at his house and he was instantly a person of interest. The bloodhounds were out for a few hours tracking but did not find the murderer. It is not exactly sure how the suspect entered the home, but we know for sure that the suspect found the murder weapon in the backyard. The axe was Josiah Moore's own axe. It's believed the suspect either followed the Moores home from the church that night and then entered the home after they fell asleep. Another option is that he waited for the Moores to go to church. He then hid inside the home and waited for them to return. He either hid in a closet upstairs or in the attic. The last possibility, he could have waited in the barn outside for them to return, and then went inside after they went to sleep. A newspaper reported that either cigarette butts or ashes were found in the attic or a closet, but this is almost certainly false. However the suspect made his way into the home, he started in the downstairs parlor. He killed Lena and Ina first, with the blunt side of the axe. Some believed that Lena woke up and tried to escape, or fought back, because she was the only one found that was not laying in a sleeping position. But it is believed that Lena was killed while she slept, and then the murderer came back and posed her body later on. After he attacked Ina and Lena, he made his way upstairs, which led to Josiah and Sarah's room. The stairs are very noisy to this day, and were just as loud in 1912. But it is believed that the suspect did not wake the sleeping parents. Josiah was hit first with the blunt side of the axe. There are axe marks in the wall above the pair's head, from the cutting side of the axe. Some believe that the killer must have been short in size in order to hit the pair with the axe this way, due to the angle of the ceiling. Sarah was the only one in the entire home that was killed with the cutting edge of the axe. The killer angled the axe and then struck her after the axe was stuck in the ceiling. The killer made his way to the children's room and he finished his initial attack one by one. Every single blow from the axe on every victim was above the neck. After the initial attack, it is not exactly sure how everything played out, but it is believed that the killer came back and gave more blows to the victims. The police investigators discovered that Sarah's shoes were on Josiah's side of the bed, and after the first attack on Josiah, the blood ran off of his pillow and some of the blood filled the shoe. They believed that the killer came back and brutally attacked the pair again after they were deceased, because the shoe was knocked over, spilling the blood on the floor after it had filled up from the first attack. All the blood was coagulated and mostly dry when the bodies were found, so it was not knocked over by the locals who poured into the home. It had to have been from the killer. The killer covered all the victims' faces with clothing that he found inside the drawers. He walked around the house and closed all the curtains. For the windows that did not have curtains, he used tacks to pin up and cover the windows with clothes that he found. He also covered the mirrors in the home. The killer roamed the home and even made himself a plate of food, but he did not eat it. A bowl of bloody water was found in the kitchen by the food. In the downstairs parlor room, the mirror was covered. A small chain was found on the floor, believed to be from Josiah Moore's pocket watch. The axe was in the room. The killer had tried to clean the axe before discarding it. A 2 or 4 pound slab of bacon wrapped in a dish towel or something similar was found on the floor. The investigators did not know what it was for at the moment, but later on it is believed that the killer used this slab of bacon as a makeshift sexual item to pleasure himself. Lena was the only one moved and positioned. It is believed that this is why the bacon was in that room, wrapped in the dish towel, and then left on the floor. The children's room upstairs also had axe marks. When the killer left the home, he locked the door. He must have found the family's key and then left with it, locking the door behind him. Josiah's former employee, Frank Jones, was the first suspect for the murders. Josiah had worked for Frank at his farm implement store. Josiah eventually left and then started his own business. It's claimed that Josiah took customers with him when he left. He also made a deal with the company, John Deere. He started selling their implements. The pair had an open rivalry around town, and they avoided each other like the plague. It is said that if the two men saw each other on the street, one would cross the road just so they did not have to walk by one another. Rumors were also started that Josiah Moore was having an affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna Jones. Detective Wilkerson believed that Frank and his son hired William Mansfield to kill Josiah. The accusations ruined Frank Jones's political career. Frank was never charged for the murders. The Reverend George Kelly was the only actual person charged for the murders, and he did actually confess. But many believe that he was coerced into confessing because of his mental illness or the police roughing him up to get a confession out of him. George Kelly was born in England. He came from a very religious family. He was a traveling minister, and he never stayed in the same place for too long. He traveled all over the Midwest, and he had many congregations. He got married in 1898. But due to his impotence, he never consummated his marriage. He was accused of being a peeping Tom many times. Some believe that is why he traveled so much. There are even cases of him asking women and girls to pose nude for him. Reverend Kelly was invited to the church event where the Moores attended that night of the murder. Reverend Kelly was just 5'1" or 5'2", and he weighed about 120 pounds. A small man even for the time. Reverend Kelly left Villisca on the train a little after 5 a.m. the morning of the murders. About 1 week after the murders, George Kelly sent a blood-covered shirt to the cleaners in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Eventually, this information reached the investigators working on the murders. Reverend Kelly made his way to Villisca every few weeks, and he involved himself in the case. Word also reached investigators that Reverend Kelly had talked with two people, an older couple from one of his churches, on the train when he left Villisca the morning of the murders. He told them about the murders in Villisca, that an entire family had been killed. Reverend Kelly left shortly after 5 a.m., and the bodies were not discovered until sometime after 8 a.m. So there should have been no way he could have possibly known about the murders. Later on, Reverend Kelly wrote a letter to the police claiming that he had heard noises the night of the murder. The police brushed him off first, believing that he was just a crazy old man. Kelly was arrested in 1914 for sending obscene materials in the mail. Kelly had put an ad up in the paper for a stenographer for a novel he was working on. The opening of the ad read, "Girl stenographer, typewriter wanted, by gentlemen, for literary and artistic work." A woman replied to the letter applying for the job. Reverend Kelly answered that she could have the job, but the job required that she had to be in the nude while working for him and typing. She gave this information to the police, and they told the local postal authorities. The investigators for the postal authority wrote to Reverend Kelly until they had enough to officially arrest him. He was eventually found guilty, but he was found mentally ill and served his time at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C. While he was incarcerated, Reverend Kelly wrote the district attorney of Montgomery County, Iowa. He claimed that he was expecting to be arrested for the Villisca murders. A few years later, the police looked at Reverend Kelly more seriously for the murders, and he was indicted by a grand jury in 1917. He was interrogated many times, and he would eventually confess to the murders, claiming that God told him to slay, and slay utterly. He gave a full confession, but he later recanted shortly after. Some believe he was beaten during the interrogation, or the investigators coerced him due to his mental illness. He would have 2 trials. The first trial was about 4 weeks long. the jury would eventually be a hung jury. 11 voted to acquit Reverend Kelly, and 1 believed he was guilty but insane. The second trial would end in an acquittal. Another popular suspect in recent years is from the book The Man from the Train by Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy. They believe that Paul Mueller was a serial killer who committed the murder. They used newspaper archives and found around 60 murders that they believed he committed over a decade with similar circumstances. Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Moore family in Villisca, was another person some believe may have committed the crime. He killed his mother and grandmother in similar ways, and he was convicted. There are more suspects, but these are the most popular ones. William Mansfield has a lot more information about his possible crimes, but there can be an entire video dedicated to that case. This was a heinous crime, one of the worst we have ever covered on this channel. I thought about doing this case months ago, but needed to go about it very delicately due to the age of most of the victims and the assault that happened with Lena after her death. This case was never truly solved. No one ever was convicted for the murders of the 8 people killed in Villisca, Iowa that summer night in 1912. Those 6 young children and 2 adults. Who do you believe committed the murders? Frank Jones? The business rival who hired a hitman? The mentally ill Reverend Kelly? The possible serial killer, Paul Mueller? Or Henry Lee Moore? Or someone I have not mentioned in this video? Put it down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as you could, folks. It was quite a hard video to make. I tried to be as respectful as possible for such a heinous crime. Thank you for watching, folks, and we will see you on the next. Peace.